My guest for this year's Spears interview is one of the world's leading authorities on geopolitics and international affairs. For 15 years between 2007 and 2022, he was the director of Chatham House, otherwise known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and perhaps the foremost think tank of its kind in the world. Before that, he held a senior role at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, the leading American counterpart to Chatham House. He's also worked as an advisor to Hackett, as well as the US headquartered investment management firm Brown Advisory. He now runs his own boutique, Ledwell Advisory, and last year released a prescient new book, The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the US and China Will Shape Our Century. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Robin Niblett. Sir Robin, first of all, could you just frame the central observation and argument of your book that the world and its two great powers are in this so-called Thucydides trap, because it's so relevant to what's going on today?
Thanks, Edwin, and delighted to be here. My microphone working? Just want to make sure it sounds good. You can hear me? Good. Pleasure to be here, and what an interesting time. I have to quickly, before going on stage, always check what happened in the last 5 minutes at the moment, because it's a rolling thunder of activity on the international stage. But just to go back to the core thesis of the book, which I think remains very relevant today, is that the United States and China are involved in a contest that will carry some of the hallmarks of the Cold War that defined the latter part of the 20th century, in particular, between the Soviet Union and the United States. Why? Well, for two reasons. In fact, I think it's likely to be more durable. It won't necessarily, hopefully, go into anything hot, but at the very least it'll be a Cold War, simply because the United States finds in China, for the first time, a truly peer competitor, a country that can challenge it at all levels: military, technological, incredibly important, obviously, and economic. Even though that expected crossing of the line when Chinese nominal GDP would cross America's, which was meant to happen in 2 or 3 years' time, now looks like it actually might never happen. Well, depends how much damage Donald Trump can do to the US economy, but nonetheless, it was certainly looking like they were going to sort of peel off from each other. But nonetheless, in terms of scale, setting aside something like the European Union, which is obviously a collection of countries organized together, the US and China each, US around 24% of world GDP, China 18-19% of world GDP. These are big behemoths. The Soviet Union, in a way, briefly caught up with America, but then tailed off and was, if not in free fall, certainly stagnating, part of the reason the last Cold War ended. So what you've got in China is a country that is still on the up economically. It's a country that is turning that economic power into military capability. Now, by deployed ships, has the largest navy in the world, not as many aircraft carriers as America. Its submarine forces aren't as good, but just in sheer numbers, they've now matched the US. And if you look at technology, there's one analysis by an Australian institute known by its acronym ASPI, which has an annual technology watch. And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the US was leading in sort of 50 of the world's top 60 technologies. Now, China leads in 54 out of 67, according to them, which is a remarkable turnaround. So if you're sitting in Washington, you see huge competition coming up here. If you're sitting in Beijing, you think, quite right, 1.4 billion people, why shouldn't we, be as powerful as America? But as they then look out, they think, well, hold on a minute, our growth and our economic security is limited by the fact the US owns the first island chain. If you're looking out from China, which hugely depends, unlike the Soviet Union, on imports of commodities and access to global markets for its exports, you are literally ringed by American allies: South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, northern Philippines, and then a whole second row of American islands: Guam, Hawaii, Diego Garcia, etc. In any case, the point being is you look out you feel threatened. So the point is there's some desire to kind of break that vulnerability. And the US, which we think of in London as a transatlantic power, NATO, special relationship. In fact, the US has generally been trans-Pacific. Didn't even get involved in the Second World War till Pearl Harbor. And Americans still tend to look across the Pacific as the kind of future in a way. So America definitely doesn't want to give up that dominant position it has there, which is very important for its own economic security. So we have a Thucydides trap, term coined by the American academic Graham Allison at Harvard, which has looked at 16 rising powers against established powers. 12 of them went to war. Very rare that you don't go to war. Obviously, we have nuclear powers today. War would be a lot more risky. So hence why I think it's a Cold War. And one more thing I would say, but it's going to take too long, so I'll just say it very quickly. I think it's also an ideological contest. It's not communism against capitalism, kind of done in a way as a concept. America is much more interventionist and less capitalist. China is more capitalist and a little less communist. It really is top-down government, small group, runs the country, they're in charge of its sovereignty, no one should challenge it, and bottom-up government. Whatever one might think about what's going on in the United States right now, it is still the chaos of democracy. And each system fears the other. Chinese think the Americans are never going to allow a communist party-led country be their equal. And they're right, by the way. And the US is trying to limit its technological power, trying to contain its military power, and as we've seen, its economic power. But the Americans also fear the rise of a one-party-led state, partly because they think, it runs like surveillance systems that are going to be applied to countries around the world, but also this fear that top-down systems of government are always insecure, paranoid, and because they're insecure, they end up externalizing their internal insecurity, a bit like Vladimir Putin has done by needing a buffer zone around him. And so Americans always think you've got to contain top-down systems of government because at some point they'll externalize their internal security. In any case, that's the thesis. I think it's still relevant today, and we're going to be stuck with what I hope is a Cold War for a long time to come.
Thank you for that introduction. Fantastic. So, the fact that Donald Trump has taken China on directly as he has in the form of this trade war and the tariffs in itself is perhaps not surprising to you given everything that you've said, but the method of doing that, the use specifically of tariffs and the whole regime that he's announced and introduced and rode back on in some cases, has that surprised you?
Yeah, I think the extent to which he's escalated. So Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, famously said in his confirmation hearings to the US Senate that he believed in tariffs, we will escalate to de-escalate. But many people thought it would be a threat of escalation to de-escalation and not a delivery. My own view had been there will be a tariff increase. Donald Trump campaigned on it. He tends to do, at least at the beginning, what he said he was going to do. If there's one thing he believes above all, it is that any country that has a trade surplus with America is stealing America's money. America is subsidizing that country. He's believed it since the 1980s when he first started talking about it. It has never gone away. It is just a core belief of his. Mark Carney was getting a little bit of this yesterday in the Oval Office. We're subsidizing Canada at $200 billion a year. I think what he meant by that is that you're running a surplus with us, therefore we're subsidizing you. Actually, the surplus, if you count services trade and goods trade, is about 50 billion, 60 billion. Quibbling about numbers, obviously, here. So, but I think he believes in them. So the question was, which of the two camps that he's built around him would dominate? Would it be the Scott Bessent pragmatic, we'll threaten to escalate, and maybe we'll go in, but then we'll bring it down very quickly? Or would it be the true believers, of whom some have been carried over from Trump 1.0, Peter Navarro, his sort of advisor on economics, who had to be pardoned from jail for not accepting to come to court or to hearings over the 6th of January storming of the Capitol. So therefore somebody loyal to Trump, very loyal, and rewarded accordingly. Or there's a guy called Jameson Greer who runs the US Trade Representative Office, was Robert Lighthizer, the first USTR's deputy. So you've got these people who are real believers that we need to change the system for the long term, start to put high tariffs on, force people to invest in America, to build there rather than us importing stuff. That'll create more jobs. We'll be wealthier. We'll be less dependent on countries like China, which is an insecure position to be in a new Cold War. Let's change the whole system and make money from tariffs that will help pay down the deficit. So, you've got a sort of a group who are true believers and a group who are meant to, be balancing those with pragmatism. Trump seems to have gone full bore, 145% on China, but he's compromising with others. Trade deals are being done. We'll see. UK this week. Who knows? I was surprised by the level, and let me just give one little anecdote on this. I don't know if it's an anecdote, but it's a data point to show how unpredictable this is. When Donald Trump was asked prior to becoming president, what would you do if China invaded Taiwan? Would you stand up for it? In your first term, you said it was a Sharpie, just a little pen, and my desk is China, and Taiwan's a Sharpie. Why would I do anything over a Sharpie? And they stole all our semiconductor business. What would you do? And he said, well, it would be a big price to pay. I'd make them pay a big price. I'd tariff the hell out of them. I mean, we'd go to 150%. He's already done. He's fired the bullet that was meant to be reserved for an invasion on Taiwan as part of his escalation.
The Economist said this week he shot his bolt.
Oh, really? Okay, same point made. I haven't read my Economist yet. Maybe I should. Yeah.
And so where does that leave him?
I mean, where it leaves him, Donald Trump is amazingly maneuverable, should we say, on any position he's had. It will turn out to be the right idea, as we know. So, where it leaves him, I think, is trying to work out, by leaving China as the only one that's got the tariffs in place today, how many other deals can I negotiate that make it look to China like, look at all these other deals I've got. I can afford to keep you at a high level until you give me a good deal. And China, on the other hand, are playing a totally different game. This is about face, about not having their leadership, and in particular Xi Jinping, third term. He said, we're kind of winning the global economy war. This was a view he put forward way back after the global financial crisis. So, he's been on a different narrative. He is not going to look like he's being pushed about. So we've had a game of chicken going on here. I'd say in the end, Trump is negotiating with himself. And he's negotiated with himself up to 150. Then, everyone else, reciprocal tariffs have been removed. Now, they removed tariffs on imports of semiconductors, minerals, which matter obviously from China, plus semiconductors, phones, etc. So he's always done a whole bunch of workarounds, should we say, and exceptions. But as of the news this morning, as you may have heard, Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer are going for negotiations in Geneva with He Feng, in any case, Li He, and a couple of other people in Geneva at the end of this week. I think they'll try to bring it down a bit. Bottom line, we're going to end up with much higher tariffs on Chinese goods. Whatever happens, the surplus is out of control. I think the Trump administration is right. But they've escalated to de-escalate, and I think Bessent has been more correct in the end than anyone else.
I know you're going to Taiwan soon. You may have a different answer when you come back, but as you sit here today in London, this is not a terribly good question, how likely is the prospect of some kind of military activity from China towards Taiwan? How likely is that, do you think?
Well, I think whether this is on the record or not doesn't really matter. I'll give a straight answer. I think, hostage to fortune, I can't see any wood around me, I think it is low likelihood in the near term. I see the near term. Xi Jinping has said, and I think the Chinese leadership would agree, that they need a resolution from their perspective to the Taiwan question by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. That's not far away. Certainly in Chinese terms, it's not far away. And they're not going to want to be 2048 and talking about it. So the question is, how much room have we got to play here? My interpretation of the situation would be if you're in Beijing, number one, you generally don't do what Moscow does. Anything that Moscow does, you watch and you say, let's not do that. Because Russia and the Soviet Union prior to it had a habit of kind of shooting their own bolt. The whole Gorbachev experiment with creating more openness in Russia first and then doing economic reform led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chinese learned that lesson, said we will do no opening up, no glasnost. We'll just do the perestroika. We'll do the economic reform, but we'll do an even tighter hold around the neck of the Chinese people and see it. And it's worked pretty well for China and for the Chinese people, the majority of the Chinese people. So I think when they look at Taiwan, a lot of people say, the invasion of Ukraine, how the West has responded kind of gives a dry run for China vis-a-vis Taiwan. But there are many, many differences. Not least, they'd have to do an amphibious landing across water. They would probably have to destroy all of Taiwan, a smaller space than Ukraine, in order to take it. It would be a kind of Pyrrhic victory. But it would be humiliation as well for China. It would say, we're not sufficiently attractive. Our communist system, our ideological top-down system, is not sufficiently attractive to defeat a bottom-up system. So it is partly tied into this ideological contest. So I'm sort of arguing my way around to try and explain why I think right now they would want to avoid, unless the Taiwanese government were to declare independence, which would be, and they've said it, an act of war from the Chinese standpoint, they're unlikely to do it. Importantly, Taiwan right now has just had elections from about a year ago. The DPP, which is the let's call it sovereignty party, they won't say pro-independence, but a number of its leadership have been quite open about this. But they won a third win in their election, but it was a minority win. They do not have a majority in parliament. And the fact that this has gone backwards, if you're sitting in Beijing, you're thinking, look, the majority clearly are not supporting them in independence. The majority want the status quo. So what we need to do is sort of change their perception of the status quo. So what we see them doing is using any excuse, and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visit to Taiwan, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, has provided an excuse for them to do military, naval, and air drills around Taiwan. And so what they're doing is sort of practicing blockades. And then now they're practicing what some people talk about as quarantines. And the idea being a blockade is in a way an act of war, so we don't want to fire that bullet. Let's start to make the reliability of Taiwan as a place for international investors to invest doubtful. Let's make the Taiwanese people start to think that their standard of living, which relies upon that global connectivity, is starting to look like we in Beijing can decide whether you have that or not. And maybe in the next 10 years, there'll be a sort of softening of the commitment to being separate, and then we need to come in with an offer that sounds better than Hong Kong, because that one didn't work out very well, but would allow a sort of soft takeover. I'm still, as you can tell, banking on some type of soft takeover, but yes, I'm going to Taiwan on Friday, and I will reserve my judgment.
Sure. And, I mean, this dynamic is just one part of a much bigger picture, as you alluded to earlier. Could we kind of take a high-level view of this, to mix my metaphors, through a crystal ball and map out perhaps kind of a worst-case scenario, first of all, for the clash between the US and China, and then perhaps a best-case scenario as well?
Well, let's start with worst, because we often end up with worst, and people like me end up talking about risks all the time. And actually, I think there are many countries and companies, and to theme of this group here, all of you individuals as well and families who are going to do quite well out of this period of instability. But on risks, yeah, look, if I want to give worst case scenarios, there's two tracks to take it on. One is to go through the lens we've been talking about. US, China, the Chinese economy suffers. In other words, the de-escalation doesn't de-escalate quite as much as people had hoped. 140%, 145% tariffs is closing off pretty much all business. Even if there are exceptions for semiconductors and so on, the bulk of Chinese people are making their money out of selling lower value goods, which are on the 145% level, to America. There is a risk that, depending on how long this takes, the Chinese economy might take a dive. The Chinese economy then and China is of course trying to sell to everyone else. The problem is China was already selling to everyone else prior to the imposition of these tariffs. And the other markets were starting to say, no, thank you. The European Union has imposed large tariffs, up to 50% on Chinese EVs. There are new restrictions being imposed on agriculture. There are sanctions because of the war in Chinese support for Russia on the war in Ukraine, an important subtext here which we haven't talked about, but maybe we will later on. My big worry is Xi Jinping may be heading to a fourth term, which he will be by 27, doing it on the back of feeling insecure about his position, and therefore he would say the Communist Party's position, because now those two things are starting to conflate, which in my mind is dangerous. China had a very good system for the Communist Party of changing leadership every 10 years. That has been broken. To me, that is a dangerous signal for the long term. What if the economy is not doing well? America can survive without global trade, to be honest. It's pretty autarkic, it's got everything. China needs global trade. So the American market folds off. Other markets start to say, hold on, we like you, China. We don't want to be on the wrong side, but you're exporting too much. Xi Jinping is suspicious of consumption as a means of achieving growth, because consumer-led societies like the American tend to demand more of their political leaders. China wants, the Communist Party wants them all just to be beautiful producers of technology and goods which you sell to the rest of the world. And I guess there's a long way of saying Xi Jinping might be in a vulnerable position in the next 4 years. And he might need to, as I said earlier, externalize his sense of internal insecurity. Taiwan could come in the frame. By that point, you might not have Trump in the White House. And America is emotionally connected to countries, small countries, that want to defend themselves, that are democratic. And if America folded on supporting Taiwan, you could have Japan saying, or Korea saying, we need to go nuclear. We can't trust America anymore. How do we know? We've got no NATO. We've got no way of protecting ourselves. And the Chinese say, no, Japan going nuclear? That's absolutely unacceptable. They are the countries who invaded us the other day from a Chinese perspective. So I could paint a pretty negative picture, principally around China feeling insecure, America missending its signals, thinking that they're being de-escalate, very graduated, China seeing, or the Communist Party of China seeing this as existential, and we could end up in a real mess. And the Russians would egg it along. Russia, I think, is getting ready for a long-term war economy as a much more intelligent position for Putin if he wants to stay in power. He almost doesn't want a full resolution to Ukraine and keep the sort of China-Russia connection tight. In fact, he'd like it to be tighter. Putin would like to break it, and Trump would like to break it. Sorry, I always confuse Trump and Putin. It comes out that way more often than I realize. So I think, Trump would like to sort of at least break the relationship a bit, not for some sort of reverse Kissinger thing, but for different reasons. So, sorry, that's the negative. I'm going to give you one more negative, though. Sorry, okay. Before I go positive. I know we've got limited time. But I would be remiss to leave this out, because we're not talking about it. What's happening in Gaza and the Middle East, this could be the fuel for a new terrorism push. Terrorism tends to take time to build up, to gain a sort of group that build a narrative and build up capability. And I think there could be a long tail to what's taking place in Gaza and Israel and Syria and Lebanon and so on, as Israel tries to feel secure again. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, as we know. So I'm worried about terrorism. Terrorism, I'm afraid, it was pretty devastating in 2001. I was in Washington through that. America, if it would happen against America again, America is, as we know, America can be brutal. Brutal, brutal, brutal.
And this would be sort of against Israel and its allies, essentially.
If it was against America, that's my worry. Yeah. If you have, whether it's a Trump or somebody else, and a terrorist attack at places, they will look for somebody to punish big time. And, you know, it'll be slightly more Israel framed. It will never happen again, and who do we whack? And that could lead to all sorts of instability and unpredictability. So do not, you know, I could paint a picture where, as I said, on the one hand, the big picture stuff I'm writing about of countries and governments and Cold Wars goes one way, but small groups with access maybe to technology they didn't have through AI and the internet could do really quite nasty things. And are we resilient? Are we ready for that? I don't know. On the positive side.
Yeah, let's spend a bit of time talking about the best case scenario. Yeah.
Let's not leave that out. So let's hope that all our security services and others have got a close eye on these groups. And obviously they've had experience that they hadn't had ahead of 9/11, so they do. But on the positive side, look, there is a re-globalization going on alongside de-globalization. If we treat US-China separation, either systemically or escalate to de-escalate, whichever of those lines you're taking, it is a rebuilding of America isn't strong enough, and by the way, I don't think China is strong enough, to de-globalize the world economy. Each of them need the world economy in different ways. China needs access to the global economy for its exports and to feed its export machine. America needs a stable world, or otherwise the world is going to come to it. Literally, Latin America will emigrate to America if they try to cut it off, climate change, lack of economic opportunity. But we have a global energy revolution underway. Whether you believe it's because of climate change that it needs to be done, whether you believe it actually, as people in Texas say, because there's more money to be made out of green technology these days, it's cheaper. It can be deployed in massively interesting, new, disaggregated, decentralized ways. Where are the bulk of the minerals, going to come to feed that? It's Latin America, it's Africa, it's Central Asia, it's across the countries of the global south. Those countries tend to have the middle classes. We're aging across the global north. So, to the extent that they can start to take off on the back of their minerals and their capability, they will do well. You've got countries like India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, who don't just want to be sort of consumers and markets, they want to be investors. Some of the biggest investors in sub-Saharan Africa right now, UAE, I believe I'm right in this, is the second largest investor now in sub-Saharan Africa. They want access to food, they want access to minerals, they want to lead on the green energy.
After China?
After China, still. Yeah, after China. Though China, again, interesting, China's investment levels into Latin America last year were the lowest since 2012. So the Chinese have kind of invested everywhere. A lot into Latin America recently, a lot into sub-Saharan Africa at the beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative. But they're kind of already in, and now we're all playing catch-up. And that's a good thing, because it means there's a competition for infrastructure, where if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, if you're in the Gulf, if you're in India, Apple will now, apparently, it's said, as many of you will know, produce all of its US-targeted iPhones in India, not in China. So I'd say there are massive opportunities for companies, countries across the global south, and any companies in the global north that are part of that transition are going to do well. And by the way, America will probably do pretty well, whatever, in niches, because as I said, it's got everything.
And so your book and your thesis is about the Cold War, these two great powers fighting one another, but what you've just sketched out there suggests a kind of second layer to this narrative, which is a sort of multipolar world where there are these countries caught in the middle playing both sides if they can. Who's doing that best?
So, I talk in the book about that actually this Cold War, there are 10 differences between this Cold War and the last one. They're all described in the book. But one of them is that the countries across the global south will not be the weak, non-aligned movement, the group of 77 of the last Cold War. They have agency. They are no longer spectators, they're players. And actually they will almost determine, I think, the future of this new Cold War. India has been playing its cards best. Again, I could say a lot more about it, but they're part of the Quad with America. They import oil from Russia, sell it to us in Europe, refined. They import arms from France, Britain, America, and from Russia. I mean, they're playing all sides simultaneously. And because they're so big, we all want to be on their side. So I think they're doing a very good job. Some parts of sub-Saharan Africa are starting to play their cards better. Brazil is about to sell huge amounts of agricultural produce to China, now that China is not importing agricultural produce for the moment from America. So I'd say some of the Latin American countries are playing their cards very well. The Gulf so far has played it well, but under Trump it's less predictable. What was good about Biden is he was kind of trying to make the new Cold War predictable. He was trying to create some initial rules and shape. These are allies, these are not allies, we all know where we sit. Trump, to put it mildly, is all about unpredictability. So if you're in the Gulf and you're part of OPEC Plus with Russia, and at the same time you're trying to get America to invest more and you're going to buy more of their products, with Trump you might suddenly say, hold on a minute, yeah, but what, you're also helping Russia run oil prices. At the moment it's good because they're taking them down. But if Saudi were ever to take prices up again, one part of Trump's brain, the bit that thinks that's inflationary, could get very upset and then turn nasty on, and he could just turn on a dime. Whereas Biden was much more steady. So all I'd say is I think some of those countries that were triangulating so well, as I wrote about in my book, are now having to be a little more on their game.
Fantastic. Well, as an academic exercise, it's fascinating to sort of take this big picture view, take this sort of systemic thinking that you're so good at. But I think the reason that I thought that it would be so applicable to our audience today is because it all does affect the businesses of those people that are here today. You have a role with Brown Advisory, that US investment management group. Can you talk a little bit about how you translate the kinds of things you've just been talking about to a business context? Well,
I think the first obvious statement, which applies to them and applies also to companies represented here, is that a lot of the growth opportunity will not be in the traditional markets. There will continue to be a lot of money made in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, to a certain extent, because we're still the wealthiest parts of the world. Look at the OECD numbers. And many of them, the UK is a very good example of this, make their market now by connecting to the growth markets across the global south. But if you're not physically located, and this is teaching you all how to suck eggs, as Americans say, but in Singapore, which has become an entrepot for the ASEAN, Southeast Asia growth of wealth, so far, ASEAN has triangulated very well. That was a great play under Biden. All of those companies that were based in China and then selling to the world from China have now had to leave plant in China to sell to China, but move plant to Southeast Asia to sell to the rest of the world. Problem is Trump is now shooting that goose. We'll see what deals he comes up with in the end. But nonetheless, I think Southeast Asia has huge potential. So Singapore has ended up being an entrepot base for a lot of the companies there. I'll come to a point in a minute. I think Singapore remains the best. I'll say in a minute why I'm not talking about Indonesia or Malaysia as alternatives. Obviously, the Gulf is self-evident. It's such an obvious point, but the Gulf has definitely been playing its cards incredibly well. But I think there are parts of Latin America that commodity wealth, agricultural wealth, these are the engines of the future, and they may end up with some slightly more populist but market-friendly governments, as we've seen. I think that sort of Trumpist element could stick, which means that the market element will create opportunities for wealth managers and for families to do well. Central Asia has always been a market for that part, but that brings me to the other side of this. And I'd be remiss not to say it, having worked at Chatham House, having done a report on, London as a centre point for kleptocracy. I think what Trump is bringing in, America is stepping back from being the rule setter. America, under Trump, has paused the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. His view, that holds American companies back from being able to do business like everyone else. I would note, because this is, this was in a newspaper, as I read it the other day. I haven't talked to anyone. I talked to somebody about it, but they hadn't spotted this little one sentence that, as Eric Trump is doing his great deals around Oman, Qatar, and Dubai right now, and building buildings left, right, and center. Steve Witkoff's son is part of the same company. Interesting. That's all I'll say. Interesting. So we have the risk, in my mind, is that we move towards a more opaque world. And opaque world is a way people can make money. No doubt about it. That's the way the world has been run for thousands of years. But this stuff can come back and sting you on brands, brand reputation. Governments can change, positions can change. So how to take opportunities from this rebooting of globalization, where countries across the global south, with different rule books, in many cases non-rule books, how companies in the global north, looking across this room, most of us, you seem to be, how we play this, it's complicated. Because Trump might be opening the doors today, but another new US administration might come in and close them and say, who was playing in this sandbox before? And then people could find themselves very exposed. And more fundamentally, and this is where I'll close on this point, I've said this publicly, I've said it privately, so I'll say it here as well. A country like Indonesia, which should be taking advantage of this moment right now of big market, it literally ticks all the boxes I was ticking. But I'm very nervous about Indonesia right now on a corruption basis. And again, I hope I'm not offending anyone in the room here, but as a former and still Chatham House person, we tend to talk frankly. So, I'm a bit worried about where Indonesia is going right now in terms of corruption. And even India, I think people feel there's more of that about now. There's more opportunity, but it's becoming more opaque. And Trump is like leaning into that.
And so there's risk, I suppose, for people who, from other jurisdictions who would go there to seize opportunities, to be involved 100%. In that could later.
You could get caught on the wrong side of that play. And I think in the end, my view is, if you're into long-term wealth creation, and that companies I tend to be involved with are involved with that outlook, long-term wealth creation, I think, is still connected to some of the things that the current US administration seems to devalue, which is transparency, inclusion, diversity. And you don't need to be militant about these things and theological. But I think they are the agents of long-term wealth creation. And so we've got to be very careful about how we play those cards. And institutions like the one I used to run were constantly navigating these things. And I think it behooves all institutions to be thinking about them.
Just a reminder that in a moment we will come to the floor and to Slido for questions, so do send them in digitally or get ready to voice them. But just picking up on this point about opacity, I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about Hacklet, who you've worked with. I think it's a really interesting company. It sort of has this mystique and aura around it, partly because of its association with former MI6 characters and that sort of thing, but a modern business now serving corporate clients. Part of the company's role is to sort of shine a light through that opacity and uncover what's there. I know you used to do a lot with them, you still do a little bit with them. Can you talk about that kind of work?
Yeah, I think the company is very public, Hacklet, about its method. You're right, its origins and history were with 3 former MI6 people. But really, the opportunity that was there for this group in 1995, when it was founded after the Cold War, was that a lot of their expertise, in a way, would have to change with a new world in which you were not having to keep an eye on what the Soviets were or were not doing around the world and in the UK and in other parts. But the methodology, which is to be able to try to understand what's going on in the world through sources, is a very valuable methodology to then apply for companies who also are trying to, as you said, navigate an opaque world. So really what Hacklet has been providing to its clients is a methodology that I think is premier. I'm not sure if it's unique, but their network of associates around the world and the networks they can bring into play means that their clients are able to triangulate multiple sources around a very complicated problem and then get a judgment call, which is what MI6 is so good at doing, and what the culture, I suppose, of Hacklet brings today is to take that and make a judgment call. So it's not like a McKinsey or some of the other firms who are crunching the numbers principally and then making the advice. They are really, as they say in Germany, a Fingerspitzengefühl, but they're trying to get a feel for what's going on, but really based on very thoughtful analysis from sources. So in today's world, where people are looking for business opportunities all over the place, they are trying to provide that. I would add that, so it's a methodology they're selling, rather than people who are doing what they were doing. So
it's their exposition of that methodology.
But I think an important element to say about Hacklet as well, they don't do any work for governments. And they're very careful about the kinds of clients they take on, where it drifts in that direction and other directions, precisely for the reasons I said earlier. They have a very, very good client list, and they want to keep it that way and don't want to, given especially the history, if you see what I'm saying, I think they see it as a big responsibility. So again, if I'd say, I like to associate with companies that take that approach to business.
Very good. And that was Fingerspitzengefühl.
Gefühl. Feel. Tips of your fingers feeling.
Okay. It's going in the
a
pocket
bit of
for
German
later.
at one point in my life, yeah.
Okay, I think we can begin to open things up to any questions from the audience. I'm sure there will be a number of raised hands. Could we go to the lady in the fourth or fifth row in the blue?
Julia Bishlinger, Travel. With America now leaning into opacity, as you said, who are the good guys?
Who are the good guys as countries or governments? Sorry, I'm throwing it a little bit back to you. You mean countries? Countries. Who are the good countries? I think, let me start big and then I won't dodge the question. I think the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, Paris-based, has been playing a very important role for the last, I don't know when it was founded, so I'm going to say, I think it was emanated out of the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, which was the precursor to the European Community, but then enlarged. In any case, it's been around for a long time. OECD has been an amazing group, founded originally by Europeans and others, but then inviting other countries in that move up the ladder economically on GDP, I think it's per capita, but then buy into rules that help sustain your high income status. So it's countries that are moving out of middle income into high income. There's a very interesting story about this because the World Bank, in its report that came out in October, did a report, I think it was titled, I haven't read the whole thing, I think it's titled called The Middle Income Trap. The difficulty countries have of going from middle income to high income, which I think is divided over $12,000 per capita, something like that. And a fascinating statistic that only, I had the number, I want to say 34 countries, roughly 240 million people, have made that move in the last 34 years, 1990 to 2024. Because so few people have been able to do it, and they've been mostly Central European countries that joined the European Union, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, some of the Gulf countries that we were talking about before. But if you set aside the kind of petro-states, they've been countries that have embraced, and this is their conclusion, institutions that favor transparency and predictability, et cetera, et cetera. And the OECD helped come up with the ideas that led to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Bribery Act in the UK and others. They're ones that talk about transparency on taxation. So the good guys, if I had to list first, I'd look at the OECD. Now, the US is a member of the OECD, obviously, and the US has suspended the FCPA. I'm not going to go beyond that. Let's say Foreign Corrupt FCPA. I'm not going to go beyond that. Let's see whether they sustain it, don't. There are many parts of the Department of Justice who've been fired who normally look into this stuff. I've been talking to some of the people who've been fired, including the network that exposed the Gibrazak 1MDB thing and so on. So America's definitely flirting with an interesting side of this ledger, I would simply say right now. But the US is a much bigger beast than one administration. So the good countries I would list, first of all, OECD. The G7 has been the steering committee for trying to develop approaches to economic governance, including sanctions and so on, that will be tough on those countries that are literally breaking international law, as Russia is doing right now. So if you're a company trying to think, where am I safe? Yeah, the G7 would be the top of your list. I'd say that's the kind of steering committee of the countries in which you'd be safe. And the G7, of course, is not just 7 countries: France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Canada, US, Japan. It also includes the EU as the 8th member of the G7. So you're in a safe space there of not getting on the wrong side of sanctions, in particular in critical supply chains. The OECD is a much bigger list. I can't remember how many countries there are right now, but it includes, as I said, countries in Southeast Asia, Turkey, all sorts of countries in there. So OECD will be my next interesting list to look at. Beyond that, it starts to get, you're going to have to apply a lot more judgment.
Any more questions from the audience that we can come to? Terence, you put your hand up earlier. Can we come to you?
One thing that hasn't really been discussed today, and which I think is very worrying, and I'd be very interested in your reaction to, is the fact that 2 nuclear nations appear to have gone to war in the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
One of them, of course, a close ally of China's. Another has just struck a trade deal, an important trade deal with Britain. There are nearly 4 million residents of this country who belong to those 2 nations, so they care very much what's happening as well.
Yep.
This must be something we should all be very concerned about. Now, I know they've nearly gone to war in the past, but this does look dangerous. Pakistan claims to have shot down already something like 5 or 6 Indian fighters. I'd be very interested in your view of where this is going and to what degree we're looking at another area of serious danger for the world.
Yep. I'm glad you raised it. I was just skimming through before we came up on stage trying to see what the latest was on this. You're right, we've had 2 particularly serious flare-ups, one in 2019, this one is so far following the playbook of a terrorist cross-border attack that in that case accounted for the lives of some 40 police cadets in I think it was in Indian-controlled Kashmir as well. And the responses so far follow that playbook. Yeah, India conducted bombing raids. Pakistan claimed to have shot down a number of planes. Pakistan then bombed back. The Indians said it didn't really do much damage. Honor has been served on both sides, and it dipped. The other one, though, was in 1999, where Pakistani forces actually tried to take some territory on the line of control, these incredibly inhospitable regions up to 18,000 feet height. And there, and it's very important to where we are today, Pakistan had only become a nuclear kind of announced state about 6 months before. So it was a really high moment of tension between the two. The Americans got very involved. I know this, it was shortly before I was working in America at the time. 99, 97. So Richard Armitage, then Deputy Secretary of State, got very involved. The Americans literally negotiated a climb down. And they played an incredibly important role. And some people have written about this being a near miss at that time, 99. Most people say 2019 was not a near miss, that at that point, honor was served. So I'm just going to tell you as I read it. I'm not going to predict anything because this really is too live. What I would say is the fact that China is a backer of Pakistan is a de-escalatory factor, as China's backing for Russia has been a de-escalatory factor on the nuclear dossier when many people thought Putin's threats of nuclear war might be real. And China apparently made it known under no uncertain terms that would be an absolute red line for us. You would lose our support. We'd kind of abandon you if you did that. I am certain those messages are being communicated as well right now to Pakistan by India, not least because India, although China's got a very close relationship with Pakistan, a big economic corridor they've been developing, they've got an access to the Indian Ocean through Pakistan that wouldn't otherwise be available to them. But India is a massive market for China. And in the end, although they don't get on well, it's a market they need for each other in the long term, especially with China now worrying about America. And by the way, India not being certain about America. And they're much kind of better suited to each other. So I think China is a player on both as a de-escalator. One of my worries right now is Trump is not available to de-escalate. They've put too much on their agenda. They're firing in all directions simultaneously. All decisions go up to him. You know, you can't say a Deputy Secretary of State. I mean, I can't remember who it is right now in the Trump administration. It may not have even been appointed. I think he has, actually, but I can't remember. It's all so chaotic. Does Rubio have power to go out and negotiate? I doubt it. Do they have the experience? They've fired so many people. So America is not there the way it was. But I think India and Pakistan are more grown up. Now, it could get out of control. The stuff becomes emotional. Countries act, we've all learnt, on the basis of emotion and not rationality. So I'm worried. But I think if I had to make a call right now, I think we're still on the road of 2019, not 99, without the Americans, which would be a big worry. So why don't I just stop there? We can talk more about it. Maybe we've got time for coffee.
A few more questions. There were a number of hands that went up. We can come to the gentleman in the light-coloured jacket. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Robin, for your insights and your snippets into your book as well. I wanted to ask you about Latin America. Latin America has almost 700 million people, and Brazil is the largest player in there with about a third of that population. And I'm Brazilian, so it's close to my heart. I wanted to ask your opinion about you mentioned Brazil is playing well in the agricultural field. And for private investors, what is your view on the potential of that growth, of that dynamism of the market? Considering a lot of institutional investors invest in Brazil heavily, for many decades without the exportation and why not? But for private investors, is there an angle for private investors to start looking into those markets in Latin America? What's your view on that?
I mean, inevitably, I'm going to start skating over thin bits of ice and move off thicker bits of ice in my knowledge base. But what I'd say about Brazil is I'm a bit more worried about its macroeconomic profile now than I was 3 years ago, tail end of Bolsonaro, definitely tail end of Lula's first term. So Lula's first term, I think the economy is in a good space. Bolsonaro, despite the chaotic stuff that he took us through in Trumpian style, the economy is doing reasonably well. As you know, the deficit rate is high right now. There's a lot of public spending going on. So I'm a little nervous about the macroeconomy, and I'm worried about a spillover of very polarized politics. There are mirror images of the United States, rural, evangelical versus urban, more diverse culturally cities. There's a worry that might tip. Now, again, going skating on thin ice, what I'm going to say is Lula may find some tailwinds now to counteract his macroeconomic headwinds from this moment of economic instability, given that Brazil, I think, is less reliant currently on exports to America compared to others, and big opportunities opening up in China at America's expense. People are wondering what might happen if Bolsonaro is prevented from retaking or rerunning the presidency. There are some actually very good quality right-leaning leaders waiting in the wings right now. Several mayors, as I understand it, and others who could play to the more rural conservative side, but also play to the side of business, which I think is not very happy with Lula this time, and a worry that he may be killing the golden goose at a moment of great opportunity. So any private investor, of course, has to look more than 2 or 3 years ahead. And so if I'm looking 2 or 3 years ahead, I'd say you've got an opportunity maybe for actually some reasonably good governance to come into Brazil if we don't get son of Bolsonaro next time round, which worries me of being a little too in the Trumpian camp for my taste, for stability economically. And then you look at all the good things of the large middle class, great commodities, federal system that's competitive with itself, which I often see as a strength for countries. Germany's benefited from a federal system. A number of other countries have done as well, America, where cities compete with each other. So I don't know, I think I'm net positive, but I'm a bit worried about short-term macroeconomy. That's my main worry right now. So you could have a bumpy ride in the near term, but I'm sort of medium to long-term positive.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last question. I saw Mark Summers had his hand up at the back there.
Thank you, Sir Robin, for a very useful, interesting global overview there. Cold wars can become pretty warm at times. And can I ask what tripwires you are actively monitoring at the moment to indicate to you that the Cold War may be becoming a hot war?
Yeah. So yeah, we don't have a sort of Fulda gap, you know, as in the last Cold War in Europe, looking at Soviet and Warsaw Pact troop levels and so on. I think, so I'm always keeping an eye on the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a place where the United States, in support of treaty allies, like the Philippines in particular, could bump up against an over-ambitious and excited naval commander or air, pilot, as happened at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, where they hit wings and the Chinese plane went down, the pilot died, American P-3 or P-9 had to land in Chinese territory. I mean, it was quite a tense moment, and now it would be a lot tenser on a lot higher scale. So South China Sea is an area of concern for me. Taiwan, you just can't take it off the list. Again, there could be a miscalculation. America and US Congress is very keen to sell weapons to Taiwan to demonstrate. And the more Trump kind of isn't interested in Taiwan, the more a Republican Congress that starts to get its feet, which they don't have right now, but into and beyond the midterms in 2026 they will have, they may want to try to do some demonstrative anti-China moves, because Republicans in particular, but Democrats as well, are anti-Communist Party of China. And they may want to sell some stuff arms to Beijing that may then, so this brings my third thing I'm keeping an eye on, the state of the Chinese economy. I think that was implicit in my answer to one of Edwin's questions. I get worried that a more hermetic type of Chinese leadership combined with a failing Chinese economy could lead them to do something rash. But net, I think China and Russia can live with each other. They've each got a journey in which they're kind of in control. And the Chinese Communist Party, ironically, under pressure from Trump, may do some of the things that they weren't doing that they should have been doing. I think, they needed to build up domestic consumption. And Xi Jinping is skeptical and doesn't understand it, and he's a believer in the old school. Eat some grass, produce some things, and suffer a bit, and we'll all be better off. And that's fine at one level, but it just doesn't get your economy going from middle economy to higher economy. So I think China might actually dig itself out. So in any case, I'm getting beyond your question. The tripwires I'm looking at, as you can tell, tend to be more on the China side and an American provocation. we can't assume that Putin wouldn't do something stupid at some point if he felt he was being humiliated and that his life was in danger, which it probably would be if things go really wrong in Russia. I think there's only one way out for Putin. You know, he'll try and stem power for his life, for his lifetime. But if he ever felt his lifetime was threatened, he again might do something rash to circle the wagons. Always keep an eye on North Korea, so I'm getting beyond stuff. A country run like a cult with nuclear weapons. But just to answer my own question on North Korea, right now, Kim Jong-un's in a pretty nice place. The Russians and the Chinese are trying to give him things. And so he's probably feeling more secure. And when dictators feel safe, they tend not to do things. And when they don't feel safe, they tend not to do things. I mean, they tend to do bad things.
Very good, thank you very much. We've got the Google lady telling us how to get to Chancery Lane Station, so that's a sign, if there ever was, to wrap it up. But before we do that, can I just leave you with 5 takeaways, 4 thank yous, and 1 invitation. The takeaways are that some of the best investment opportunities now lie outside of America and in tangible assets. That's from Steen Jacobsen earlier this morning. Philanthropy is in crisis, but if we want to make a difference, the time to act is now. That's from the Duchess of York and her colleagues on that panel. Miami is perhaps the hottest real estate market in the world, but there's also value in London. If you want to buy a cheap luxury watch, go to Japan. And finally, as a home for wealth creators, Britain will be back. But if you believe the right honourable gentleman, it might take a Tory government to make that happen. The thank yous are to the Spears team, our host at the Savoy, Sir Robin, of course, all our panellists, and our kind partners, without whom today could not happen. So I will name check them again. Black Lane, the Charities Aid Foundation, CMB Monaco, HCA Healthcare UK, Henley & Partners, Interpolitan Money, Invest Barbados, Maddox, Mars Capital, Stewardship, and the invitation is to join us all for a drink in the bar. Thank you very much.